as I told you right before we started the video, that thing that I mentioned is really the most important thing you're going to hear all semester. So, you know, it's too bad it didn't end up in the recording. I'm kidding, I'm
Of course you
kidding.
would say that.
I'm kidding.
Oh, the second.
Alright, so inherently distinctive includes arbitrary or fanciful. Whether something is arbitrary or fanciful, it doesn't really matter. It gets you to the same place, which is this that I marked in red. This idea that you don't need secondary meaning. And suggestive actually is still in that category. So even suggestive marks really are practically the same as arbitrary or fanciful in terms of the effect that it has. But there's a distinction to be made. Suggestive marks, as the term would suggest, are marks that suggest the product or the service rather than describe it. So let's, talk about the third category. So you've got 1, arbitrary or fanciful, 2, suggestive, and then 3 is descriptive. So it's easier to sort of understand the suggestive and descriptive by comparing them to each other. So a suggestive mark is something that does have a relationship with the product, and here I am standing in the middle. It does have a relationship to the product, but it's not a descriptive, a purely descriptive relationship, right? So Apple describes the product if you're talking about apples. It tells you what the product is. A suggestive example would be something like Netscape. So it's good that you mentioned Yahoo, because there you have 2 sort of internet-related marks. One of them is arbitrary because Yahoo, the expression Yahoo doesn't seem to have anything to do with searching stuff on the internet. But a term like Netscape, well, it's got net in there, right? And so we're talking about something that has to do with a network of some sort. It's also something that throws a net over this landscape, right? And so Netscape, you can think of a lot of, it's also about escaping, right? You can think of the marketing guys, having a brainstorming session about this and saying all the things that it suggests without specifically describing this is a web browser. But it sounds like something that could be a web browser. It could be other things, but it suggests what the product is. Another great example is Coppertone. Coppertone. And remember, always think of these marks as related to the product, right? So Netscape for a web browser, Coppertone for a suntan lotion, right? It doesn't tell you I'm a suntan lotion, but it suggests that it has something to do with getting a copper-like tone on your skin. Have you guys realized that before? One of the things that I think is interesting about a lot of these marks is sometimes you hear them and for the first time you get it, right? You're like, oh, that's why it's called that. It's like the Häagen-Dazs thing, I thought it was somebody's name, and no, it's actually related to the product somehow. And that's one good way of sort of making the distinction between suggestive and descriptive marks, right? If it could, for a second there, pass as something that has nothing to do with the product, then it's more likely to be suggestive than descriptive. And so these are also considered inherently distinctive. And again, what that entails is that they can be protected without the need to establish secondary meaning, which I haven't told you what that is yet, but I will. By the way, the roster should be around. You haven't signed it.
I have it.
Yeah.
Right there. So Williams is there.
What is it about Haagen-Dazs?
Oh yeah, that was while you were out. Haagen-Dazs is a made up word. It's completely fancy. Yeah. Most people think it's the last names of somebody.
Invented in the Bronx, the guy who created the company thought it was a Danish-sounding name when the Danish language doesn't even have the 2 dots over the A, the aqua, it doesn't exist. It's gibberish. It means nothing in any way.
It's like Kodak M0. Let's throw it in here. Why not? Is it CS or S?
DAZS.
I completely made it. Alright, so suggestive. I don't have anything more to say about suggestive. Now, descriptive. So, descriptive marks are not considered inherently distinctive. And they are basically things that describe the product. Now here's the big thing. Descriptive marks are only protected if they acquire secondary meaning. Now, what are some examples of descriptive marks? One of my favorites is International Business Machines. Other than YouTube, does anybody see what that is? IBM, right? The original name of IBM is International Business Machines. That's descriptive. It tells you what they sell. They sell these machines, of course, they came up with this at the beginning of the century, last century. So it wasn't about computers yet, right? It was these machines that you could use for business purposes, and they wanted to sell them around the world, so International Business Machines. Yeah.
So Geico would fall under the same.
Geico, I guess, yeah, it's very similar, right? Geico stands for Government Employee
Insurance
Company, something. Now, the interesting thing is you have 2 different things here, right? The whole International Business Machines name, and you also have just the acronym, IBM. Now, the acronym by itself, like Geico, right, it's become something that nobody knows what it stands for anymore. Radar, laser, right, all these acronyms that used to mean something. And now they're a word in themselves. Then you can think of IBM as arbitrary or maybe even fanciful. Just the 3 letters together by themselves to describe computers. But if you look at the whole name, International Business Machines, it's descriptive. And so descriptive marks only gain protection when they acquire secondary meaning. Now, what does secondary meaning mean, right? What is this secondary meaning thing? And it means that the word has grown in the market, in society, in the jurisdiction, to create that source identification. It links the mark with one specific product. and one specific source. In other words, you have to prove the existence of that source identification. If your mark is inherently distinctive, I don't need to prove that. It's sort of assumed that it's there. If the mark is descriptive, I have to establish as part of my prima facie case that that source identification actually exists in the mind of the average consumer. That's quite a tall order, and we'll talk in a minute about how you go about doing that, how you prove that in court.
So secondary meanings. The original understanding of the word has evolved so much as to have a particular source identifier.
Exactly. The primary meaning of international business machines is machines to do business internationally. Right? That's the primary meaning that it has in regular language. But now, through the years, right, it has become associated with one particular product and one particular source for that product, and has therefore acquired a secondary meaning in the consciousness of the average consumer. And I should mention at this point, there are mythical figures in different bodies of law that are important, right? The reasonable person in tort law, right, is this mythical being that becomes central. In trademark law, it's your average consumer, right? That's the mythical person that we're trying to please. In patent law, we'll talk about the facile, right? The person having ordinary skill and blah, blah, blah. We'll get to that. Yeah.
So, where does something like a Google fit? Like Google as a, because it had a definition before it became a search engine that had this, representative meaning that I'm sure kind of inspired them to, or that they chose it essentially with this in mind, that they could produce these gazillion results for people.
Actually, it's a intentional misspelling of the,
Well, yeah, I did,
number.
yeah, but it's a reference to that original word, Googol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they changed it to
So
GOO.
where does that fit? Because it's meaning to play off of.
I'm gonna do the favorite thing that law professors
It
do.
depends.
Where does it fit? You tell me.
Oh, great.
Right? Where do you think it fits?
I don't know. That's why I asked.
This is what it's about. Is it arbitrary? What's the relationship between the product and the mark?
Yeah, I would say it's arbitrary. Fanciful because they misspelled it. It's not even a real word.
Okay, so there's the misspelling issue, and that might make it fanciful. And we'll talk about the Satterine or whatever the hell, I don't know how to pronounce that case name, the fish fry case. Right? There's a footnote in the fish fry case. Did anybody read the footnote? I must teach the courses in which, and the cases in which the footnotes are the most important footnotes ever, like Caroline products.
Oh wait, so just because it's spelled a certain way, was that what they were talking about? Fish fry spelled F-R-I?
Right. They say the fact that it's misspelled isn't sufficient to make it fanciful. Page 786, note 3. We note at the outset that Satterine's use of the phonetic equivalent of the words fish fry, that is, misspelling it, does not render the mark protectable. Now, the language the court uses isn't very, does not render it protectable. It's very, not the most specific language. This is the Fifth Circuit in 1983, so take it with a grain of salt, right? But the idea is that by its misspelling a word by itself does not, according to the Fifth Circuit, turn it into fanciful. Okay? Fanciful, that's why I gave you these examples, right? They are completely made up. So you said that there's an arbitrary relationship between the product and the mark. But let's ignore the misspelling for a second and say that doesn't make a difference. Which it may or may not. I mean, again, a lot of these things are a matter of degree, right? Fry with an I instead of a Y doesn't change that much. Google, it's a little bit more of a change, and at some point you change it enough, right, that it might become fanciful. So, but is there really? So let's assume that the misspelling doesn't matter, and therefore the word means a really, really, really big number. Is it arbitrary, the relationship between that and a search engine?
Yeah, I thought no. I mean, it seems like if that's the point of their search engine, to give you these gazillion results, then they chose the name with that in mind. And they wanted to elicit that meaning, perhaps. I don't know, though.
Right,
I mean,
so
it depends if it's even used in language. Like, had it even, I mean, to most people, did they know what GML meant? Like, does that matter?
But remember, again, I mean, the average consumer, right? You're the average consumer. Well, you're not the average, except you're not. Right? You're the well-educated, law-studying IP person consumer. But it doesn't seem to be fanciful because the misspelling doesn't matter and this word actually existed. It's not quite arbitrary, at least it's not totally arbitrary, right? There's a sense that huge number and a search engine that gives you a lot of results that encompasses this huge network of things that is almost as ginormous as this number. There is some relationship there, so it seems to suggest something. But your argument is, yeah, but it only suggests it to mathematicians, right? I mean, it doesn't suggest it to the average consumer. Does it describe the product? Definitely not, right? It's not descriptive. So at least we know it's somewhere in this area. And you know what? That's good enough. At least for practical purposes, that's good enough. Because the result's going to be the same. It's protected without secondary meaning. In an exam, somebody might get technical about that. I won't do that kind of thing. It's not the kind of exam I write. And you're not taking the bar on IP, so I don't really know. Yeah.
But now it means what it says, right?
Oh, now it's a whole other thing, right? So we were talking there for a second about at its origin. Years later, what is it now?
Search, yeah.
It means searching something, right? And I think it's mentioned in your casebook also, in one of the problems or something. If you use it as a verb now, right? Oh, I Googled you, and I got these results. So that might actually take us to number 4. Which is where you guys have been driving me towards constantly. Which are generic marks. Now generic, or really I should call them generic terms, because the whole point of generic is that they're never protected. So if you choose a generic term for a mark, you're SOL. You have chosen poorly. Okay? Generic marks don't get protection. And it goes to what we were talking about during the break, right? We are not going to grant anyone a monopoly over the use of a word that is generic. Because everybody needs to use the word apple when they're talking about apples. When you're talking about computers, you can use computers, you can use PCs, you can use business machines, you can use all kinds of other words to describe a computer that are not Apple. But if you're talking about an apple, you're going to call it by its name. And so, generic, one way of thinking of something being generic, and let me go back to the cases. Let's see, I'm skipping, by the way, I'm skipping Qualitext for a minute because I think it goes deeper than we need to at this point, so I'll come back to it either at the end of today or the beginning of next time when we talk about 2 pesos. So let's skip politics for a second, not for very long. And Saturday really is the case that you have that gives you a very good description of everything I'm talking about, right? This idea of the levels of the marks. And it tells you about generic, where are you? A generic term is the name of a particular genus or class of which an individual article or service is but a member. This idea of a genus versus a species, if you will. It's a generical term, right? That's where the word comes from. So the genus might be computers. The species is bell in danger of extinction. Apple. HP, whatever. And so because it describes the general category of things, it is not allowed to be protected as a trademark. Now, the other thing that happens is this phenomenon of genericide. Which you are all very excited about. And I'll talk about that in a minute, in more detail. And so Google gives you that example of, is it suggestive? Is it arbitrary or fanciful? It sounds like it's suggestive. Okay? Even though to a lot of people they won't get the suggestion. And that raises the question that the court deals with in Saturday of how do I distinguish between suggestive marks and descriptive marks, right? Great little case, actually. I think it's very helpful. It gives us a very clear test, or at least a series of factors to consider when deciding whether something is descriptive or not. And the first thing it does is it tells us, dude, don't complicate yourself, right? Look at the dictionary. Dictionary, it's a repository of what the average person thinks words mean. So look at the damn dictionary and figure out, is this a word that appears in the dictionary as describing the product or not? If you look up computer in the dictionary, it's going to tell you it's a machine that this, does, and that. And so it describes the whole genre. If you look at Apple, it's going to tell you it's a fruit. It's not going to tell you it's a computer. That's one thing. There might be dictionaries out there that now tell you that Apple is a computer. That points towards genericism. But when they came up with that term, it certainly wasn't in the dictionary. 2, look at the imagination test. I love this. It's like, makes me think of Willy Wonka. Your imagination.
That has, show that movie to your 5-year-old. Might cry. She's fully out. It's creepy.
It is super creepy. That's why I love it. My 5-year-old watched it a lot when she was like 2. And she loved the song and whatnot. Now she's a bit more on the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, like more version. But yeah, my wife loved it because it's so the imagination test is this idea of, does it require a bit of a leap of your imagination to get from the word to the product, from the mark to the product? And so with Google, you have you certainly need that lead. And so that would rule it out of the descriptive category immediately. Because you need that imaginative lead to get from one place to another. Same thing in Netscape, Coppertone. Number 3 is whether competitors would be likely to need the terms used in the trademark in describing their products. And again, this goes to this idea of we don't want you monopolizing the words that need to be used to talk about this thing. And then number 4, whether it has been used by others marketing a similar service or product. So it's sort of like number 3 is, do competitors need to use it to describe the product? And number 4 is, have competitors used it to describe the product? Now, take number 4 with a big, ginormous grain of salt, right? Because this is a little bit circular. Number 4 is circular, right? Because the question we're asking in the first place is, can people use this? So at the very least, we know the defendant has used it, because that's why they're getting sued. But the idea is, in general, have other competitors used it before? Is it something that has been done, and all of a sudden this guy is trying to sort of monopolize it. So relatively clear test for distinguishing descriptive marks from other marks. And you can use the same factors to some extent to think about generic also. Except that if you're talking about descriptive, all of these things are sort of subject to this particular type of product. In generic, it would have to describe the whole class or genus of products. Like the Murphy bed example is a good one. Does it describe just beds that go up against the wall? Does it describe beds in general? Does it describe only the beds made by Murphy? And that goes, again, to this idea of secondary meaning, too. All these things are sort of interrelated, right? And it goes back to what's in the mind of your average consumer. When they hear the word fish fry, what do they think about? Do they think about this specific brand, or do they think about frying fish in general? Or products, frying fish in general would be on the generic extreme. Products with which you batter up fish to fry, then would be sort of in the descriptive part. It's not a whole class of anything having to do with frying fish, but just the batter, but not the specific batter from this producer. Does that make sense? It's like a continuum, and it gets tricky, but that's what it is. It's a continuum. Questions, comments, suggestions? Yeah.
When we talk about the average consumer, is it this sort of general average consumer, or will they ratchet it up or down in what knowledge they'll attribute to that person based on like the market you're in? Like the average consumer of cars is one thing, but the average consumer of
That is an
some sort of
excellent,
highly technical things.
as usual, Mr. Lunsford, that is an excellent and difficult question to answer. And it's not, I would say it's not definitively established, but I would say that courts do take it into account. So, particularly, I mean, the more refined the industry and the consumer associated with the industry, right? If you're talking about Learjets, you're not gonna take into account us, or, you know. It's a very sophisticated, and there are better examples than that, right? If you're sort of in the business of buying products for production purposes, you know, I'm the maker of Learjets and I'm buying turbines. You know, well, you're gonna consider the people who buy turbines as your average consumer, not everybody on the street. And you're gonna refer to their knowledge of those kinds of products, right? I mean, if you're talking about, what was the example you did? Whatever, sugar, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about sugar substitutes. You're gonna be talking about how people think about sugar substitutes, not about how they think in general about food. So yeah, there is some fine tuning there, but I wouldn't say there are clearly established rules. So, you know, it's not dissimilar to the FOSIA kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure. All right. Moving on to the next board because it doesn't fit in here. Let's talk about secondary meaning a little bit more. Make sure I got everything here. So as you can see, this idea of secondary meaning is pretty important. And this case talks about it quite a bit in, I think in a way that's relatively clear and helpful. And one of the things that they do is they talk about how do you establish secondary meaning, how do you prove it. And I mean, it's important, right? Again, if you're in the inherently distinctive world, you have saved yourself a lot of money in attorney's fees if you end up litigating. Because in attorney's fees and in expert witness fees, and that's what I'll talk about in a second, because you don't have to prove any of this stuff about secondary meaning. It's just taken for granted. If you have to prove secondary meaning, then you have to bring evidence. And that costs money. And so the court in Satterang says, well, you can do this in several ways. You can bring circumstantial evidence of secondary meaning. What is that? Well, you can bring evidence of all the advertising that you've done to establish, to create that secondary meaning. Right? We had earlier on the board this idea of developing the mark. So you can show how much have I developed that mark through advertising? How much have I developed it through sales? Right? The bigger the volume of sales I have, one would think, the more likely people associate my mark with my product, because everybody has had an encounter with my product. More people have had that encounter. The other thing that you might consider is something like the length of the use. How long have I been using this mark, you know? Fish fry, established 1864, you know? Hey, we've been selling this thing for 150 years. Chances are people have heard about it, right? You know, and we sell it all across the nation, and we advertise on national TV, you know, and we advertise during the Super Bowl. Yeah, so it's not direct proof, of course, because you're not reading the minds of the average consumer, but it's things that circumstantially tend to, you can reasonably infer that people would have developed this secondary meaning for the mark. Now, the other thing you can do is direct evidence. And this is the part particularly that is very expensive, and that it's sort of the standard in these litigations. I mean, if you're gonna litigate secondary meaning, you should bring some consumer surveys, okay? Otherwise, and again, this is a sliding scale, you know. If you've been around for 150 years and you sell all across the world and you do advertise in the Super Bowl, well, maybe you don't need the consumer surveys because it's sort of obvious that there's going to be secondary meaning. But chances are, if you're Coca-Cola, nobody's going to try to say your mark doesn't have secondary meaning. You know, you're not going to be involved in the litigation in the first place if you have such well-established secondary meaning. These litigations tend to happen with companies that are relatively new, relatively low. And so what you do is you bring these consumer surveys. Now, to make the consumer surveys, you gotta hire someone, right? That costs a lot of money. You gotta hire most likely an expert who's gonna go out in the field and actually hire a bunch of people to sit at the supermarkets or the malls or whatever and ask people, you just bought this product, you know, do you know where it comes from? Do you associate it with a particular company? Why did you buy this brand instead of the other brand? Yada, 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 to establish that idea of, yes, they bought Coca-Cola because they associated with a company from Atlanta that they know has quality control and that they like to taste it. Not just because it's some random soda. And the other question that comes up is, what do you need to establish in those consumer surveys? What numbers do you need, right? So you might ask a very simple question, you know, you just bought this product, or you haven't bought this product. When I say equal, what are you associated with? Right? When I say the word equal in the supermarket, what are you associated with? And the person will either say, oh, the sugar substitute, or they will say, I don't know, you know, that we're all the same, yeah, that, you know, that black and white people can come to the supermarket and buy things. You know, you don't have separate supermarkets for black and white people, you know. And so you tally that up, right? And you say, what percentage of the people I asked gave me the right answer, in this case, yeah, it's sugar substitute. That is made by these particular people, that is blue, and that's the one that I use, and I never go to Splenda. You know, it pisses me off when I go to a restaurant and they only have Splenda. That's the one you want. So at the end of the day, you're going to tally it up and say, X% of the people I asked gave me the right answer. Well, what's the magic number, right, that establishes secondary meaning? And that's a question you could have asked me, and I would have had to say again, it's a very difficult question. We don't have a clear-cut answer. I can tell you there's a case that says that 28%, which is a pretty low number, is not clearly, to say that 28% is enough is not clearly erroneous. And then they wonder why attorneys, you know, make so many caveats and make everything so complicated. How many negatives did that say? Saying that 28% is enough to establish secondary meaning was adjudged by an appellate court as not being clearly erroneous. That's sort of the best I can tell. So that should tell you, if I get a survey with 50% of the people saying they associate this mark with this product, you're doing really well. You can point to this case and say, wow, 50% is twice as much as that. But if you land in the 25% area, you know, you're treading dangerous waters. 28% is not a lot when you think about it. Only 28% recognize the source of the product, and the court said, we'll let that go. So that's what you do. You bring these services. There is something interesting here, and I don't know if I should mention it here or there. I can't fit it in here, so I'll put it over here. But there's this thing called the New York Rule. Because of course, New York courts adopted it at some point, even though they have retracted a little bit from it, or I mean, it's a big grain of salt. But in New York, you had this doctrine that obvious rip-offs of descriptive marks would infringe without the need to prove secondary meaning. So it was kind of like an exception to this general rule that descriptive marks are only protected if you can show secondary meaning. And so New York did that for a while, still good law. It hasn't caught on in the whole country. You can think of the pros and cons, right? You can think of policy reasons, particularly in terms of you're a small business, you're starting out, somebody blatantly rips off your mark, and maybe you don't have the money to bring the suit and prove secondary meaning. Or maybe you want to encourage that entrepreneurial spirit even before you've acquired the secondary meaning. Now, so there's two things about the secondary meaning thing that are important. The first one is it costs a lot of money to prove. The second one is it makes a huge difference for the startup business. Because if you have an inherently distinctive mark, you get protection from the get-go. If you have a descriptive mark, you don't get protection until you've established secondary meaning, as a matter of fact, regardless of whether you can prove it. So if you're a startup business, that first year, doesn't matter how much money you got for litigation, you're not going to be able to prove that you have secondary meaning because you don't, right? And so descriptive marks, almost by definition, are not going to get protection from their inception, whereas inherently distinctive marks do. Okay, so basically, what I'm talking about here is tell your clients to think of a better freaking name, right? And clients tend to, I had a friend in college that had this company, and we always kid about, we thought he might be in the secrets, in some country's secret service or something, because he just seemed like the kind of thing that you see in a James Bond movie. He was into import and export, and the name of his company was Allied Consolidated Incorporated. And we would tell him, you guys are really together, aren't you? Really tight. That name isn't worth anything, from a trademark perspective. Yeah.
I'm saying how it would save you money, like on the front end, doing the arbitrary, but isn't there a greater earning potential if you had more descriptive, just because it'd be easier to recognize for the public? It might not be worth all the litigation costs, but I was just thinking about it.
Potentially, yeah. I don't know. That's sort of like a marketing expert question.
Good example of that is Standard Oil,
Right.
Rockefeller's company.
Yeah. I don't think you needed the help of it. Have the oil, you can do whatever you want. But yeah, and it depends on the industry, right? It depends on the consumers that you're targeting. It's probably depends. I don't know anything.
Yeah,
about
it
marketing.
seems like there'd be a lot of variables.
Yeah. But yeah, again, when you advise your client from a trademark law perspective, right, you tell them get a inherently distinctive. But who am I to tell Cupcake to change their name, right? It seems to be working fine, right? And of course, the value of your trademark is different depending on the business that you do. You know, if you're a local cupcake shop, what do you care about a trademark?
Well, and if you're in Charleston, you know, like you said, there's a different
Right.
scene here, so coming up with a fanciful name here might be more valuable right from the beginning than it would be in a city that doesn't have this huge flourish of local food scene.
Right.
So many factors.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, and that's a good thing to think about. You know, I like to sometimes not talk about the law so much, talk about, you know, what it's like to practice. A lot of attorneys sort of get stuck in their attorney role in a very narrowly defined way, and they can only talk about, no, you gotta have an arbitrary mark because I'm a trademark lawyer and that's the only way in which I can think. You know, well, no, I mean, it's a business. These people have all sorts of other factors to consider. Obviously, if you're hired as a trademark attorney, your job is to tell him the trademark perspective, but I think we're all human beings, you know, and we can sort of step out of our box and say, but this is just the trademark perspective. I mean, I understand if you don't follow my advice because you've got 100 other things to consider. And maybe the trademark isn't valuable in your particular industry or in your particular business model, you know. Maybe you have a patent over something, and who cares what your trademark is? You know, you got a patent on the thing that's valuable. So yeah. Anyway, but it's things that obviously you need to consider when you're talking to clients about these things. How much is enough? Geographic spread. Oh yeah, there's also this idea of, it's not really clear, but it seems like Patent Trademark Office won't sort of acknowledge that there's secondary meaning unless there is some level of geographic spread of your product. Meaning, if you're asking for federal registration of a descriptive mark, you might want to have sold your product not just in downtown Charleston, you know, but maybe in Greenville and, you know, Charlotte and Savannah, and so it's easier to establish secondary meaning if, you know, if it's a little spread out. But that's neither here nor there. I was just going to mention it briefly, but it's not a big, clear thing. Oh yeah, I wanted to mention something that's not on the board anymore. That's a problem. Oh no, wait, yeah. Let me put it here. The descriptive marks. So I'll talk about them in general, but there are a few kind of specific types of marks, that are descriptive, that are noteworthy. And I just wanted to mention them briefly. One of them is personal names. This happens a lot, right? People name their business after themselves. That is considered a descriptive mark. So if you're gonna, and that's the example of the Murphy bed, right? If you're gonna call your bed Murphy bed, you're already choosing to force yourself to prove secondary meaning. And you might say, well, what's the relationship between Murphy and a bed? That's arbitrary, right? It should be like Apple. Well, that's not the rule that we've created, right? Because of the particular character of personal names, because different people share those personal names, we have decided to say that personal names used to sell products are descriptive because they describe not the product but the source. And so in order to protect them, you have to show secondary meaning. So, you know, again, clients love giving their businesses their own names. It's something you might want to tell them, particularly if it's a business that you foresee having value in a trademark. Hey dude, you might want to reconsider that. Maybe make some sort of fanciful twist on your name, right? Instead of Murphy, call it. Come on. Get creative. Same thing happens with geographic marks. You're going to call your, engineering company Charleston Engineers. You're not going to be inherently distinctive. You're going to have to establish secondary meaning. And in the meantime, somebody else might come up with a second engineering firm or call it Charleston Engineering 2, and then or Charlestonian Engineering, and then have problems. Which happens a lot too. Yes.
So when someone's built like a personal brand, say like a politician or somebody, like decides to, create a product that is also tied to what their personal image is to, could you not argue that that would be somehow suggestive that their personal brand represents a certain thing in that community, realm, place, or area?
I could point to that.
That's a good question, and it made me think immediately of Paul Newman sauce.
Okay. There you go, that's a good example.
What are you implying with your tone and your he's a good-looking, he used to be a good-looking guy, I have to say, You're going to have to experiment. Paul Newman's a good choice. I'm not saying.
Another good example is, it made me think of another Eddie Murphy movie, Boomerang, where he plays the con man who gets elected as a political representative just because he happens to have the same name as this guy who got elected in that district over and over and over again and had the same name, and then he dies and so.
Right.
Or I think about like the Kardashian products or whatever, like they're a huge brand based on their personas, and now they created this huge thing of products that's, some of them are named after them or something, Dash or something like that.
I think,
So how does that work? Those could be descriptive?
I think
Or sorry,
they're-
they could be suggestive.
I think there's still this script. That's a tough question too. I mean, I think it depends on the specific facts. Who is the celebrity? What do they stand for in the consumer's mind? And what's the product? So, Kardashian for beauty products is one thing. Paul Newman for barbecue sauce is another.
That's true, yeah.
Like Paul Newman for barbecue sauce seems to not have anything to do with it. So it's just describing the guy. Whereas Kardashian might be suggestive of some. I don't know. I think for the most part they will still be descriptive, and then you would have either an easier or a tougher time improving secondary. And I think if you go Kardashian beauty products, you might have it easier at establishing secondary meaning, but you still do. Not 100% sure, and I don't think it's come up. I mean, the thing is, you also have the right of publicity issue that would sort of creep into any litigation of that kind. And I think it's been litigated more on the right of publicity side than on the trademark side. But it's an interesting question. I'm not sure there's a clear answer. Paper material, right? Anybody's writing articles for law reviews. Oh yeah, geographic marks. Another cool thing about geographic marks is false designations of origin or geographically inaccurate marks. So, sorry? Like Haagen-Dazs
You want it to
almost.
sound like.
Right, not quite because it's not geographic per se, But yeah, but that kind of thing. An example that I think is in your casebook is Chicago the band. And you can think of all kinds of different ways in which you can play with that, because sometimes you'll have things that are almost like parodies, you know, that you're making fun of something by naming your product something, you know, Yankee brisket or something like Connecticut Yankee brisket, you know, you're sort of parodying yourself or your product or whatnot. And there are sort of special ways in which the Act deals with those things. I'm not going to get into them in detail, but I encourage you to look at the actual Act and see how it deals with that, because it can be tricky and different. So, I'll put a but C. False designations of origin. And just to sort of give you an idea, it depends on your intent and the likelihood that it will cause confusion, right? If you're Chicago the band, nobody's gonna care that, it doesn't matter whether you're from Chicago or not. People are listening to your music, and it doesn't matter where you come from. But if you are actually doing it in a way, of course, if you're trying to mislead people, if you're selling your product as if it is from somewhere when it's not, and that matters for some reason, like the wines and champagne and that kind of thing. So let's imagine that there are no collective certification marks, not collective certification marks regarding wine, but you try to pass off your wine as being from the Napa Valley. And the courts and the Act looks at that differently, because it tends to create consumer confusion, and that is what we're trying to prevent. So anything really that tends to create consumer confusion is going to be looked at disapprovingly by the Act and the courts and the PTO. PTO, Patent and Trademark Office. Whereas if you're doing it as a parody, or you're doing it, you know, in an arbitrary fashion like Chicago the Band, well then it's not, you're not going to run into those kinds of problems. All right, so that's that. Genericide. Am I getting to genericide? I'm impressed that I'm getting to genericide. Oh, yeah, I wanted to mention doctrine of foreign equivalence. This is an interesting one. What happens if you use words in a different language, right? How am I supposed to consider them in this picture? And what the doctrine of foreign equivalence says is that you translate the word to English first, and then you do the analysis. But, as your casebook says, the courts have not applied this very consistently. And so some of the examples that you have of cases, particularly from the Patent and Trademark Office and the TAB, which is the appellate, the administrative appellate body from the PTO decisions, seem to not apply this doctrine very well. So you have this idea of la posada, which is Spanish for the inn. Well, what is that? If you translate la posada to the inn for hotels, and for a place to sleep at night, or renting a room, where does it land? Generic, right? It's clearly generic. However, you have this case saying, no, we're going to allow it. We're not going to call it generic, because nobody really knows what la posada means. Well, then, I get it that nobody knows what it means, but the whole point of the doctrine of foreign equivalence is that you don't care that nobody knows what it means. You translate it first. And so you have these inconsistent cases, the same thing with Veuve Clicquot and the widow. So, you know, that's out there. But you can make the argument, and hopefully you get to a court that applies it correctly. Acronyms, marks, prefixes, I mentioned all this. Genericide, where's BARD? I need to talk about BARD at some point. Well, let's talk about genericide first. So we have this Murphy bed case. Which deals with this idea we've already sort of been talking about quite a bit of what happens when a mark, a word, shifts in meaning, right? It was a made-up word at one point. It was something that only served to identify the source of a product at some point, but because of its continued use in society, in the market, in the jurisdiction, it has acquired a different meaning. It's almost like secondary meaning on steroids, right? I mean, the secondary meaning has grown so powerful that it has overpowered that primary meaning, but in a way in which it excludes the source identification, right? Because now it means, so these people make these beds that you know, oh God, pull up against the wall, thank you. That's why you gotta sleep, you see? If you don't sleep 8 hours a day, this is what happens. That's why you good job, yes, good job, both at the same time. So they pull up against the wall, you know, we've probably all seen those kinds of beds. And how many of you refer to them as Murphy beds? 4 or 5 out of 6. And so Murphy was a guy that made them, you know, and so it's become this idea of we just call that type of bed, right? Again, the genus, by that name that used to be a trademark at the inception, but that now it's used to describe all kinds of wall beds. And one of the things that the court deals with in this case that's important is the burden of proof. Because normally, the plaintiff, right, the trademark owner, or the alleged trademark owner, has the burden of proving distinctiveness. So this is sort of like your normal default standard rule. Distinctiveness is part of your case in chief, right? You gotta prove as part of your prima facie case that you have a distinctive trademark. However, in the context of genericide, it's almost like a defense. The burden shifts to the defendant if they are claiming genericide. Now notice something here. I mean, this and Murphy bed is not the best example because it's a personal name, it's descriptive, yada yada. But think of Xerox, right? There's no question that Xerox originally was fanciful. And so it was inherently distinctive to begin with. And so if Xerox sued someone in year 2 of their existence, they wouldn't have had to prove secondary meaning or anything like that. They would have just said Xerox is a fanciful term in the complaint, and that was that. That's all they had to do. Of course, you still have to, allege it as part of your prima facie case, but you wouldn't really have needed any proof other than look in the dictionary and the word doesn't appear, right? If it became a question. But as time in year 30 or year 50, all of a sudden, the word now has acquired a different meaning in the consciousness of society. And so that defendant in year 30 who gets sued by Xerox might say, hold on, your mark is no longer inherently distinct. Your mark is now generic. Now, because I am sort of changing things, right, changing the status quo of the thing, the burden shifts to that defendant to prove that that has actually happened. That shift from fanciful to generic has actually happened. Or that, in other words, genericide has occurred. So genericide is this term that the courts use to describe the death of distinctiveness in a mark. And so it must be proven by the defendant. Now, some examples just for fun. And these are examples of, now I remember what it was that I wanted to play. These are examples of things that have actually been held to be genericided. Have turned generic when they initially were not. And some of them are kind of crazy, right? Like elevator, and escalator. Who knew that those were actually originally trademarks? And then you can think of other examples of things that might be, right? Like Xerox, Kleenex, Pampers. What was that? Band-Aid. Band-Aid.
Ketchup.
Ketchup is a trademark.
KETCHUP is a type of catsup made by Heinz. But almost nobody spells it catsup. Everyone just says ketchup.
Cool. Yeah, so something that's interesting too, I can think of things in Spanish that have become generic, or even in Puerto Rico specifically, or in a particular area of the country, things like that. And it's really interesting how that happens and how we play that out from a federal perspective. Something might be generic in, like Coke, right? There's a section of the country in which any soda is a Coke. You guys know this? Right? There's soda and pop and I don't know what else. And then there are people that just say Coke. I want a Coke. What Coke? What are you like? Which type of Coke? And what they want is, I don't know, Sprite. They call it Coke. Yeah, it's freaky like that. Now, the other thing that we get here is how do you establish genericide, right? And so our friends in Murphy give us a series of factors. Number one, they say that we're going to give a lot of deference to the PTO and the total. The trademark, now I forgot.
Trademark Trials and Appeals Board?
Yeah, what's the second T for?
I thought it was trial and appeal.
Something like that, yeah. Anyway, the TTAB, so the PTO, I mentioned this the first day of class, the first week of class, but remember, the Patent and Trademark Office is in charge not just of patents, but also of registering federal trademarks, right? That's where you register your federal trademarks. We'll talk a little bit more later about the registration process. But so that's why it's important in this context, because if you are going to register the trademark, the Patent and Trademark Office will pass judgment, not as strictly as it does with patents, but it will pass some judgment on whether your trademark is acceptable. And one of the main things that they're looking for is it distinct? Right? So if you try to trademark Apple for apples, the Trademark Office is going to say, no, that's a generic term, sorry, can't register. And so you have these rulings by the PTO and the TTAB, which is the appellate entity that you appeal the rulings of the PTO to before you eventually get to court. And so the court says, we're going to give deference to the PTO and the TTAB. They are sort of the expert administrative agencies involved in these procedures, so we first and foremost give deference to them. Then number two, again, we're going to look at dictionaries. So, that's when I was saying this is a continuum, and I was being really unclear about it. This is what I mean, right? In distinguishing between descriptive and suggestive, you look at dictionaries. In distinguishing between generic and non-generic, you also look at dictionaries. It's all about what is in the mind of the average person. How does society gauge these things? And then number three, you're going to look at culture, right? So things like newspapers and magazines. Even maybe like trade publications, right? Advertisements, anything that might give you an idea of how people use this term in society. One thing that they say they're not going to look at is policing efforts by the owner. One thing that happened at some point, I think in the 80s, maybe a little before, maybe in the 70s, you have a big photocopy of this ad from Xerox. Xerox would publish these ads in magazines and whatnot, saying, stop using our mark in a generic fashion, right? Stop calling it Xeroxing. Call it photocopying. And so that's a way of the owner of the trademark trying to police the use of their mark. They can't force you to not use it, but they were sort of trying to get people to stop using it in an attempt to keep it from becoming generic. The court in Murphy-Dorbed says that we're not going to take that into account. Your policing efforts are neither good nor bad, they're just irrelevant to the analysis. Now, that could lead to the question of, well, why do it then, right? Why do they police these things? Well, it still might help convince people to stop doing it, right? Even if it's not going to do anything in court. The other thing that is interesting about these genericide situations is it's almost like you've been hoisted by your own petard, right? In a not so ironic fashion. I mean, your mark is so good that people have adopted it to talk about the thing itself. It's better than the regular word, and your mark is so strong in a way that it loses protection. And so it might lead you to ask, well, Xerox, what's the big deal? I mean, people are still going to keep buying your product. counter argument is, yeah, but there's a lot of other people out there making photocopiers and they're crap. You know, and I'm losing that association between the good photocopiers and my mark, Xerox. And people are just saying, oh, Xeroxes suck. And I don't want them saying that. You know? And I spend a lot of money making sure that my Xerox photocopiers are actually of high quality. And I'm getting sort of thrown into the category of crappy photocopiers. You know, so there's a lot of things there to consider. How much does a business person want to spend in policing their mark? And yeah, there's a certain irony to it, you know, that your mark was so good that now everybody uses to talk about the product of your competitors. My attitude, to a certain extent, is wear it as a badge of honor, you know, go with it. Because when people decide they're going to use a word in a particular way, I don't think there's much you can do to stop them. And you know, aspirin is a great example. I still buy Bayer, you know, 100 years afterwards. And I think the dominance of Bayer in the aspirin market is huge. They lost the trademark. It hasn't affected their business that much. I don't know. So that's genericide. We are out of time for today. Finally, I'm about to collapse. I'll play the Barbie thing. Oh, here's one. So I'll leave you with this.
If someone stood up in the crowd and raised his voice up way up loud and waved his arm and shook his leg, you'd notice something. If someone in the movie show yelled, "Fire! To the second row! This whole place is a powder keg!" you'd notice something. And even without clucking like a hen, everyone gets noticed now and then. Unless, of course, that personage should be invisible, inconsequential. Cellophane, Mr. Cellophane, should I bend my name, Mr. Cellophane, 'cause you can look right through me, walk right by me, and never know I'm there. I tell you, Cellophane, Mr. Cellophane, should I bend my name? Cellophane, 'cause you can look right through me, walk right
You know
by
you've
me,
been genericide
I never know
when you're in a Broadway musical.
Look, Danny, I'm afraid big guy.
Amos. My name is Amos.
Who said I wasn't? Oh, it's a constant. You know what you said? Now, we pass out those cigars every day. I don't want you to think.
What is this?
What?
It is.
Laugh? Why would they laugh?
Here's a copy of Roxy's first statement, and the honest. You, 4 months behind.
She would know. Yeah, I guess we haven't done no copywriting since. Wait a minute. That don't figure out right. I couldn't be the father.
Well, forget about that.
You mean she needs a meal ticket? That's all I ever bet, but this time she's gone too far.
One of my favorite places in the world.
Oh, Jesus.
You're damn right.
Yeah.
I'll divorce her. Probably won't even notice. A human being made of more than air. With all that bulk, you're bound to see him there. Unless that human being next to you is unpleasant.
but
You
it can be pretty fun.
know.
Take the class there.
Ooh.
This one, I should have offered that before you
Yeah,
did
I'm still.
videotape the other one. I meant
Should I?
tell you. Anyway,
spend my
it's there if you want to do it.
Thank you, yeah.
cellophane? 'Cause you can look right